Good evening, folks. Welcome to an Oz Cyclone Chasers Cyclone video update for the public today, the 15th of March 2016. It's been a while since our last one. As always, our updates are sponsored by our major sponsor, Campbell Scientific Australia, when measurements matter, and my name is Chris Nitzo. Looking at the OCC Weather Centre radar imagery from the Bureau of Meteorology, we can see the monsoon is kicking off scattered showers and thunderstorms across the Northern Territory into the Arafura Sea and the Gulf of Carpentaria. Weipa's radar looks spectacular at the moment, as does Cairns, where we're seeing the monsoonal northwesterlies starting to mix with these easterlies coming in off the Coral Sea. This mixing here of those northwesterlies and those easterlies is going to create a fair amount of rainfall across this northeast coast of Queensland, anywhere from around about Townsville northwards. But the focus of our discussion tonight is going to be this low pressure centre. Now, the low pressure centre is located just probably over water, just on the Queensland side of the Queensland-NT border. It's moving east in a fairly rapid fashion over the next 24 to 48 hours. Will make landfall here in the southeast Gulf of Carpentaria. It does have a very small window of development into a tropical cyclone, but it needs to get into real open water, not being impeded by Mornington Island and surrounding islands in this area. So if it can get into open water, it does have some pretty good conditions to intensify, but the problem is that it's going to be moving fairly quickly away to the east, and it just may not have the time to do so. Regardless what it does, the rest of it's set in stone, so we're definitely going to see heavy rainfall across northeastern Queensland, definitely going to see some heavy falls across the northern and central peninsula as well. Whether or not that low develops into a cyclone doesn't really matter, because the end result here for southeast Gulf of Carpentaria is going to be very similar for places like Corumba, Normanton, and to a lesser extent Burketown. Let's take a look at the low pressure system. So, looking a little bit closer at the system here, you can see the circulation centre located probably just offshore, as I say, just on the Queensland side of the Queensland-NT border, now starting to push fairly quickly away to the east. It's been sort of sitting around Borroloola for about 2 days, and now it's only just starting to get a bit of a move on as these monsoonal northwesterlies start to catch up with it. Looking at the convective cloud tops, we can see some very deep convection associated with the tropical low, and we can also see some very deep convection associated with the monsoon further to its north. Looking at the environmental steering flow right now, there's very little doubt about the movement of this system. So what this chart shows us is what the winds are doing at around about 1.5 to about 6 kilometres up in the atmosphere. In general, what they're doing is they're going to be pushing this system either to the east-southeast or to the east, and the system should, and there's a very little doubt about this, make landfall here in the southeast Gulf of Carpentaria. Likely to be Kowanyama southwards. So we're going to talk about all the different model projections for this system, and then we're going to start talking about the rain. And I know that's what most people want to know. Is it going to rain at my place? Well, we'll talk about that at the end. But let's talk about the low first. Now, initially, this is the only computer model that is predicting this weird scenario. So this weird scenario is shown by the GFS. The system is expected, as I said to you, to move in a southeasterly direction, but only for the next couple of days. It's then expected to sort of sit here in the inland parts of the Gulf of Carpentaria, and then there's a ridge at the surface that builds in underneath, and the weak low pushes up here across the Arnhem coastline and out into the Timor Sea or the Joseph Bonaparte Gulf. Certainly a strange scenario, and certainly one that the other computer models don't want to borrow. For instance, when we look at the UKMET model, which is a much more plausible scenario, shows us that the system will track east and then eventually wash out on the 17th somewhere in the inland parts of the Cape York Peninsula, before a new circulation forms off the coast of Cairns to Cooktown and pushes rapidly away to the east-southeast in between Vanuatu and New Caledonia. The CMC computer model also shows the same thing. However, it gets very confused. Once the system actually makes landfall here in the southeast Gulf, it gets quite confused as to what to do with the remnants of the circulation. And eventually it pops it off the coast here of Cape Melville and then continues it eastwards just for a little bit before starting to drift it back towards the coast here of far north Queensland as a low pressure system. Meanwhile, it forms another low way out here in the central Coral Sea and pushes that out here to the southeast towards the North Island of New Zealand. Looking at the much less accurate NavGem model, we can see that the system is located here in the southeast Gulf of Carpentaria in 5 days' time. It just hasn't moved anywhere. That is simply bizarre to see it just located in exactly the same spot as when it started, pretty much, for the entire 5-day period. Look, I can't see that happening. There's got to be an easterly shift here. The steering mechanism towards the east is just too strong for this scenario to happen. But look, if it did happen, you would be seeing monumental rainfall here across the northeast coast of Queensland, and just Noah's Ark type stuff here across the southeast Gulf of Carpentaria. But as I say, I cannot see this possible scenario happening. Looking at the CMC computer model ensemble, so this is a bunch of the same model done at the same time with slightly different starting conditions in each one, and this is what they spit out at us, and we use the sort of average of this to figure out, approximately what should happen. And generally this is what the models come up with: an easterly motion crossing the coast somewhere between Cairns and Cooktown, and then continuing out here into the east-southeast fairly rapidly into the eastern Coral Sea. Nothing is ever set in stone when it comes to cyclone forecasting, and especially so in the Gulf of Carpentaria. If you think the Coral Sea is hard to predict, the Gulf of Carpentaria is near impossible to predict. And purely and simply the reason it's impossible is normally it's just a little bit too far south to be governed by what's happening with the monsoon, and it's just a little bit too far north to be governed by what's happening with the ridging, and it's just a little bit also too far north to be governed by what's happening in terms of upper level troughs. And so we've got a situation where the system tends to tinker and loiter in that Gulf of Carpentaria between a number of different steering mechanisms, and those steering mechanisms hardly ever are able to just take control of the system and take charge. And that's the problem here. This is why we're seeing such variations in the computer forecast models between a westerly solution and easterly solution. It sort of goes all over the place. Makes our life a nightmare. I can't imagine what it's doing to the poor meteorologists at the Bureau. Looking at the European model, thanks to tropicaltidbits.com here, we can see that the system moves reasonably rapidly out here to the east. In 48 hours' time has made landfall here on the southeast Gulf of Carpentaria. Then things get very interesting, because we have this low sort of just lingers then right on that western Cape York, or just inland of the western Cape York. Then we have a new low that spins up just to the east of Cairns, and then we have a bit of byplay between these two systems, and then eventually they all go away to the east and fairly rapidly, and one of them develops into a tropical cyclone. So the Euro's a little bit all over the shop here in its expectations, especially with multiple vortices developing, multiple circulations developing along the monsoonal trough. And so that makes things very difficult into the future. One of the things you can tell, though, is that we've got a bit of an upper level low here in the southern Coral Sea, and I'll just change our view to the southwest Pacific here so you can tell what I'm talking about. See this little yellow area here? Now that little yellow area is actually an area of cooler upper level air, and that cooler upper level air tends to be also associated with fairly strong northwesterly winds in the upper levels, and those northwesterly winds are the things that guide tropical cyclones, and they're going to guide these systems out here to the southeast, and that's exactly what's happening on the European computer model here. We can see that they're both pushing towards the east or the southeast, depending on where they are in relation to that upper level low. The only hope for far north and Queensland for an extended period of heavy rain is that if this low doesn't push as quickly out here to the east, what we then have is what we call an upper level ridge building in behind this upper level low. And if that upper level ridge starts to build in quickly enough, then if the low is there's a lot of ifs here, by the way, then if the low is located up here, say in the northern Coral Sea, the ridge will start to take hold and the low will push back towards the west. Now that is a fairly low percentage scenario, so if I was a betting man, and I sort of am, and I was giving you two different scenarios, I'd put basically about $1.10 on the scenario pushing out here to the east, and about $8 or $9 for the scenario pushing back out here to the west. So you can see that the favourite scenario, of course, is this one where they push quickly away to the east in the Coral Sea. But sometimes the outsider wins. Alright, enough about the longer term. Let's have a look at the rainfall over the next 24, 48 to 72 hours. BOM earlier today got on the front foot, I should say, and took the initiative and issued a flood watch for the Gulf Rivers, Cape York Peninsula and the North Tropical Coast region, purely and simply because the North Tropical Coast region will start to see an increase in rainfall from tomorrow on. So tomorrow we start to see moderate to heavy falls developing anywhere. As I said, Townsville seems to be the cutoff. Anywhere north of that along the northeast coast starts to see an increase in rainfall. We're going to see some moderate to heavy falls also across northern inland sections in showers and thunderstorms that could spread to rain areas. But really the bulk of the activity here on the western peninsula, as I say, Kowanyama seems to be a bit of a hot spot here on a lot of the computer models, but extending all the way north to the Torres Strait. The Torres Strait has had a really dreadful wet season, by the way, one of their worst ever. And so it's great to see some of this rainfall extending north to them as well. But the southeast Gulf of Carpentaria and the western peninsula seem to be the focus of activity tomorrow. Now, as we go to Thursday, though, or Wednesday into Thursday, you can see some very heavy rainfall developing along the northeast coast of Queensland, more than likely around the Cairns area, but it could be just north or just south of that region. And that will depend very heavily on what the monsoon does and any eddies that spin up along that monsoon. And that's what computer models are struggling with. We know that this is our dominant low, but we don't know what it's going to do once it hits the coast. Is it going to keep moving eastwards, or is there going to be a new low that pops up off the coast just here, off the coast of Cairns to Cooktown? Very difficult, and that's why I'll be updating you every night here, and subscribers every morning as well. So subscribers, you'll get 2 a days. General public, you'll get 1 a days at night time to have a look. Now, as we go to Friday, all of that rainfall starts to push offshore, and no matter what's happening here, either whether the low spins up off Cairns or whether that Gulf low continues tracking northeast, no matter what happens, we see a decrease in rainfall. As we move on to Saturday, we'll see all that rainfall pushing further and further to the east, or further to the north up here, dependent of course on what those lows do. So that's the expectation, folks. Looking at the very latest GFS forecast modelling here and looking at the accumulated precipitation over the next 3 days. So this is exactly from 4 p.m. today to 4 p.m. on Friday. You can see this area of the northeast coast. Oop, where'd I go there? There we go. This area from the northeast coast of Queensland, looking at the possibility of 200 to 300 millimetres. Now, whether or not that's just on or just off the coast is very hard to tell here on the current resolution. But we can also see very heavy rainfall here in the southeast Gulf of Carpentaria associated with that low. Now, bearing in mind, of course, the GFS model will be skewed because it has the low stopping in here and then pushing back to the northwest. If that doesn't happen, we would probably see an increase in rainfall here, but a decrease in rainfall here. So that's something to be bearing in mind when you look at that rainfall chart. As I say, it's very difficult to predict rainfall in this situation because we know that everyone's going to be getting rain Townsville northwards, but it's so hard to pick those exact points that are going to be getting really big rains. All happening over the next few days, folks. Check out our Oz Cyclone Chasers official Facebook page, our website too. We now have a blog, and we'll post consistent updates there over the next few days as to what's going on with this system. We'll have another video update for you tomorrow night. Remember, if you want the nitty-gritty information, head over to our website, ozcyclonechasers.com.au. Click on subscribe. Help us out in our documentary efforts of tropical cyclones, and get yourself the best and latest information on tropical cyclones, both currently and well into the future. Thanks for watching. I'll have another update for you tomorrow night. Enjoy the rain if you live north of Townsville, or rather Townsville northwards.